Hi everyone, this is our lecture on the TCA cycle. So let's get started. To get a clinical perspective, let's look at a quick flash case. Let's say a 63-year-old man is brought to the emergency room by his son after worsening dementia, now including hallucinations. He's been experiencing diarrhea too. On physical exam, there are notable rashes and areas of hyperpigmentation on his skin. Let's keep this all in mind as we go through the lecture. Our learning objectives for this lecture are to describe the importance of the TCA cycle, identify irreversible enzymes and cofactors of the TCA cycle, and to recognize the steps of the TCA cycle. Okay, before we get into the details of the TCA cycle, let's take a look at the big picture first. Here is the summary of our metabolic pathways, and the TCA cycle is down at the bottom here in purple near the star. Now notice that at the top it's producing citrate from acetyl-CoA. But where did that acetyl-CoA come from? Recognize that it's coming from glycolysis and lipid metabolism. Down toward the bottom of the image is succinyl-CoA, but see, that can be derived from protein metabolism. We also have fumarate, which can come from the urea cycle. The last step involves formation of oxaloacetate, which can come from pyruvate from glycolysis. And it can also feed right to phosphoenol pyruvate to jump into gluconeogenesis. I know that's a rather brief summary, but the point is, all of metabolism is intertwined, and the TCA cycle is a huge driving force in metabolism. Let's find out how it does that. So here's a closer look at the TCA cycle. What does TCA stand for anyway? Well, it stands for tricarboxylic acid, since the first two steps produce citrate and isocitrate. And if you go back to organic chemistry, you'll realize that both citrate and isocitrate have 3 carboxyl groups in them, and thus tricarboxylic. The TCA cycle is also known as the Krebs cycle after its discoverer, and the citric acid cycle, again, because it produces citrate first. Now, remember, here in blue at the top is acetyl-CoA, and the role of this cycle is to release stored energy from it. Well, how does it do that? It produces high-energy electron carriers like NADH and FADH2 to generate ATP via oxidative phosphorylation and the electron transport chain. This energy helps to drive cellular metabolism. These reactions occur in the mitochondria. Let's focus here at the top of the diagram first. The reaction driven by PDH, or pyruvate dehydrogenase, turns pyruvate into acetyl-CoA, and this produces 1 NADH and 1 carbon dioxide. Okay, now let's get into this lower section of the cycle. For every acetyl-CoA, the TCA cycle produces 3 NADH, which we can see in these steps here, 1 FADH2, seen here on the left, 2 carbon dioxides, or CO2, here in blue, and 1 GTP, here in yellow. This all equates to approximately 10 ATP per molecule of acetyl-CoA. This is going to require some math and estimating, and maybe jumping to the video on the electron transport chain. But to make it simple, 1 NADH molecule can yield between 2 and 3 ATP. So we represent 1 NADH as 2.5 ATP. Similarly, 1 FADH2 can produce between 1 and 2 ATP. So we say 1 FADH2 can yield 1.5 ATP. And then 1 GTP yields 1 ATP. I know that doesn't add to 10 yet, but remember we get 3 NADH per acetyl-CoA. So instead of 2.5 ATP, we get 2.5 times 3, or 7.5 ATP from NADH per cycle. Now, to make things tougher, but something to be aware of in questions, is whether they ask if the ATP is per acetyl-CoA or per glucose molecule. Because for every glucose, we get 2 acetyl-CoAs, so everything would be doubled. Recognize that there are irreversible enzymes as indicated by the asterisks. They are pyruvate dehydrogenase, which forms acetyl-CoA from pyruvate, citrate synthase, isocitrate dehydrogenase, and alpha-ketoglutarate dehydrogenase. An interesting clinical correlate is that the alpha-ketoglutarate dehydrogenase complex here in this box requires the same cofactors as the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex, and those include vitamins B1, B2, B3, B5, and lipoic acid. But what does that mean? Well, if we're deficient in any of these cofactors, then the reaction will not be carried out. Think back to our flash case. Was it possible that one of these were deficient? Now, I know I haven't walked through all the steps with you, but there is a helpful mnemonic to help you remember the order. And it's citrate is Krebs' starting substrate for making oxaloacetate. Citrate is for citrate produced from citrate synthase. The I in is represents isocitrate, which comes next. The K in Krebs should remind you of alpha-ketoglutarate. Next, the first S in starting should remind you of succinyl-CoA. The second S in substrate should remind you of succinate. F in 4 is for fumarate. And I also like to remember, as you can see in the diagram, that the only FADH2 molecule that is produced is also produced with fumarate. Then we get malate and finally oxaloacetate. So I hope that helps. You may have to go through it a few times. Great, let's do a quick flash quiz. How many ATP are produced per acetyl-CoA molecule with the TCA cycle? Yep, 10 ATP are produced. 3 NADH produces 7.5 ATP, 1 FADH2 produces 1.5 ATP, and 1 GTP produces 1 ATP. Be careful and recognize I asked for acetyl-CoA. If I asked for glucose, the numbers would be doubled. Let's go back to our flash case. Did you think of a cofactor that may be missing? Remember, B1, B2, B3, B5, and lipoic acid. Here's a hint. He has dementia, diarrhea, and dermatitis, the 3 Ps of vitamin B3, or niacin deficiency, also known as pellagra. The question here may ask which steps of the TCA cycle may be affected because of his nutritional deficiency. And of all the steps or enzymes listed, you'll be looking for alpha-ketoglutarate to succinyl-CoA by alpha-ketoglutarate dehydrogenase. It will also affect the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex, but that is prior to the formation of acetyl-CoA and entering the TCA cycle. Well, we've made it to the end. What's the bottom line? The TCA cycle drives metabolic processes by releasing stored energy from acetyl-CoA by producing high-energy electron carriers like NADH and FADH2 to generate ATP via oxidative phosphorylation and the electron transport chain. That's all I have for you here. Please give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and it'll give you the opportunity to submit a comment if you have any feedback or questions. Thanks for joining me. Study hard.